Hello, Pete the Wargamer here, and this time I'm back with another Warhammer 40k painting tutorial. This time I'll be guiding you through the process of painting the Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, Marneus Calgar, and as usual I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. Before we can begin painting, we first of all need to prime. I've used a grey surface primer before applying Macragge Blue over the top. You can use a Macragge Blue spray paint for this task, alternatively you can airbrush if you have one, or simply apply it using a regular brush. I've also only partly assembled the miniature and have kept a number of these individual components separate to make painting those tricky areas much easier. This was achieved very simply by drilling a small hole with a pin vise and using a small bit of superglue to attach a length of wire. We can kick things off by painting the black areas of the miniature, but before you do, you'll need to thin down your paint. This is a process that will be repeated throughout all the base coats that I'll be applying to this miniature. So take your paint, in this case Abaddon Black, and mix it with a little water. Add some water in small amounts until your paint has a consistency that's thicker than milk but not quite as thick as the paint that you started out with. This thin paint can then be applied in several layers, resulting in a much smoother coverage. With your Abaddon Black thinned, you can then start to paint the leather belt, the areas between the armour panels, the pipes on the arms, and finally the bolter stocks. Take care not to overspill onto the blue armour at this stage. However, if you do, you can easily touch up these mistakes with a little Macragge Blue. Next, we can tackle the red parts of the model. This includes the back side of the cape, the optics on the bionic eye, helmet lenses, and also the cords running across the chest panel. For this task, we'll be using Mephiston Red. You may find that the red paint doesn't cover quite as well as the black paint did over the blue, so ensure that you're applying the paint in thin layers, allowing the previous layer to dry fully before starting the next. If you've added the severed Tyranid head to Calgar's base, you can paint its protruding tongue and also entrails using this colour as well. The next base coat will be to the leather straps hanging from the belt. For this area we want to achieve a dark, slightly reddish brown colour. You'll find that Rhinox Hide is perfect for this. As you can see, this is another component that I've kept separate. Had I glued this to the waist, I would have had to be careful to not accidentally spill the paint onto Calgar's legs, especially when painting the rear side of the strips. With the brown leather base coat completed, we can now turn our attention to the inner lining of the cloak as well as the parchment of the purity seals. A couple of thin coats is especially important here, as lighter colours such as white, light greys and cream will be less forgiving when it comes to showing imperfections in the surface colour. While in other areas 2 coats may have sufficed so far, don't be surprised when painting lighter tones if you find yourself needing to paint that one extra coat. Again, if you've added the severed Tyranid head, you can also use this paint for the skin as well. If you're tackling the helmetless version of Calgar like I am, then you'll need to paint his skin. A base coat of Bugmans Glow will give us a good starting colour to build up from, and will provide the darker skin tone that will remain visible in the recesses of the face. For the purity seal on Calgar's belt, use a little Screamer pink to achieve that faded wax effect. For the numerous areas of ultramarine iconography dotted about the miniature, as well as Calgar's hair, you will want to use a base coat of Celestra Grey. Now grey might seem an odd choice for painting white, but it will allow us to use an edge highlight of pure white later on. As mentioned before, light greys can be very tricky to get a smooth coverage with, so make sure you water down your paint and apply several thin layers. Next, we want to tackle the hazard stripes on the power cables running to the gauntlets. For this, we'll be using Averland Sunset, which, as a base paint, should cover nicely over the black base coat that we already have. To apply this paint, start off by painting a series of thin lines diagonally along the cable's length. Keep the spacing between them as equal as possible. Only focus on one side of the pipe before switching the angle of the line and painting the other half, giving you a series of downward facing arrows. With the sides of the stripes picked out, you can then fill in each alternating segment, much like a checkerboard, using the Averland Sunset again. With every other section painted, you should be left with a hazard stripe pattern. If your Tyranid head is of High Fleet Leviathan, you'll want to apply a base coat of Naggaroth Night to the carapace found on the forehead. For the ruins that Calgar is stood upon, apply a base coat of Mechanicus Standard Grey. You'll find that the colour is a great starting point for the concrete effect that we're looking to achieve later on. The last 2 areas of base coat are the metallics. We'll be starting off with a dark silver of Leadbelcher to paint the various areas of bare steel across the miniature. These include the segmented pipes of the gauntlets, ammo belts and bolters, just to name a few. Metallic paints can be much more difficult to cover over if you overspill, so make sure you take your time with this particular step. The final base coat to apply is one of Retributor Armour. We'll be using this to paint all of the golden adornments of Calgar's armour. You can also use this paint to pick out the empty shell casing on the base. Following on from our base coat of Retributor Armour, we next want to apply a layer of Liberator Gold. When painting layers, follow a similar process as you did with the base coat, but don't paint into the recessed areas. As this paint is slightly less yellow than the Retributor Armour, you will find a nice contrast in colour, which will help to make those details stand out. Once you've completed this step, make sure that you thoroughly clean out your brushes and paint mortar, as you don't want to cross-contaminate the metal flakes found in these last two paints into your other non-metallic paints. The next set of steps will involve applying some glazes to our miniature. These add a translucent layer of paint to the surface, which will subtly adjust the colour and shading of the area. The first of these is Guilliman Blue, which can be pretty much applied straight from the pot. When applied over the armour, it will help to improve the richness of the blue colour. Don't apply too much glaze with your brush, as you want to keep it even across the surface. If you apply too much at any one time, the glaze will instead flow into the recesses and act more like a wash. The next glaze is for Cadian Fleshtone. However, this time you want to create your own glaze by mixing in some Lamium Medium. Create a mixture of 1 part Fleshtone and 2 parts Lamium Medium. Then you can apply this mixture over the skin. You will find that the first layer is very thin and will only subtly lighten the skin colour. Allow this layer to dry and then apply a second layer over the top. However, instead of covering the whole face this time, only apply this to the flat surfaces and not into the recesses. Repeat the step once again, applying less of the mixture into the recesses. This will result in a smooth transition between the darker recesses and the lighter raised areas. In this step, we'll be using a glaze to add some shading to the recesses of the outside of the cloak. Like our last step, you'll want to mix in some Lamium Medium with some Rhinox Hide in 2 parts medium to paint. However, instead of applying our mixture onto the raised parts of the cloak, you instead want to paint it into the folds of the cloak. With each subsequent layer, focus your application deeper into the folds to create a transition of dark brown in the deepest recesses to the lighter red on the raised areas. For the underside of the cloak and any other areas that we painted with Rakarth Flesh, we'll be creating our usual glaze mixture using Deepkin Flesh. This time, follow the same steps as you did with the face and apply your glaze just to the raised parts of the cloak, leaving the darker Rakarth Flesh visible in the recesses. Continue this step when painting the Tyranid head on the base and also the parchment as well. So at this stage, our miniature has all of its base colours and a few glazes. However, currently it looks a little bland and the details aren't quite as obvious as they should be. This can be remedied by applying some washes. Washes are pigments in a much thinner medium that allows it to flow and pool into the recesses, giving the effect of shading and therefore deeper, more pronounced details. This will ultimately help to achieve a much more realistic appearance. The first wash to use is Nuln Oil, and we'll be using it in 2 ways. The first will see us painting the wash directly into the recesses of the armour and the white areas. By applying the wash this way, we can maintain the blue of the armour and clean white of the symbols, while still having some strong definition in those depths. Using a thin brush and mixing in just a drop of water with your wash will really help with this particular step. The second method of application will see us applying the same wash as before, but over the entirety of the silver metallic, grey hair, brown and purple areas, not just in the recesses. This will darken the overall colour of the surface as well as creating that definition that we're looking for. Using Reikland Fleshshade, we next want to wash over both the face and the gold areas of Marneus Calgar. This will help to bring out the details in the facial features, whilst also giving the gold a slightly, very subtle reddish hue. The next area to wash is the flesh of the Tyranid head and the purity seal. For this, we'll be using Carroburg Crimson. For the head, instead of an all-over wash, we instead want to just focus on the recesses. This will result in a pale skin colour with only a hint of purpley pink. You can also use this wash to apply a very subtle reddish shading to the lips and mouth as well. For the remaining parts of the miniature that we painted with Rakarth Flesh, which include the inside of the cloak and parchment, as well as the empty shell casing, you'll want to apply a thin layer of Seraphim Sepia. To add some shading and to create a dirtish brownish hue of the concrete ruin on the base, apply a wash of Agrax Earthshade. With our washes completed, we can now move on to applying some edge highlights. Edge highlights are great for bringing out smaller details and creating sharp looking edges. To do this, take a brush with a fine point and dip it in some slightly watered down paint. This is lighter than the base coat. Then use this brush to paint on a thin line along the raised edges. We'll be starting off with the blue armour, and for this we'll be using an edge highlight of Calgar Blue. Before we continue with the highlights, I will next be adding some battle damage to the gauntlets, as no doubt the paintwork will become damaged after smashing through a few enemies. To do this, I'll be starting off with a small, unordered specks of Abaddon Black around the knuckles and fingers of each gauntlet to represent a small nick or dent in the paintwork. Next, we can apply what I call an extreme highlight of Fenrisian Grey. These are great for helping certain aspects of the model to really stand out. Extreme highlighting follows the same principle as regular highlighting, but you will only apply this highlight to the more prominent edges such as corners and other sharp points. In addition to the extreme highlight, we can also apply some of this paint around the bottom edges of the black scratches that we applied in the last step. This creates the illusion that damage has a slight three-dimensional appearance to them. At the moment, the black parts of the miniature are looking very flat as they haven't had the benefit of a wash. However, we can remedy this with an edge highlight of Eshin Grey to pick out those details. For the red areas, start off with an edge highlight of Evil Sun's Scarlet. This will require a degree of freehand work for some of the folds, as you will want to paint a thin red vertical line down the centre of the folds. To finish off the rich red colour of the red, apply a small extreme highlight of Fire Dragon Bright over the most prominent parts of the lines that you painted in the previous step. For the strips of leather hanging from the belt, we want to continue giving them that dark reddish brown appearance. This can easily be achieved by running a thin line of Doombull Brown along the fold and edges of the strips. Applying a few small dots of Squig Orange to the corner creases of the leather strips will help to give them a slightly worn effect. The next highlight will be to the lighter areas of the miniature, such as the inside of the cloak and the white iconography. For this task, we'll want to use some white scar that should still be slightly visible against the lighter colours. For highlighting the robe, paint some thin lines similar to those we painted on the reverse of the cape. You can also use this paint to add a small dot of reflection to any optics on the miniature. Also, when moving to paint very light paint such as this, I would recommend refreshing your paint water to prevent any cross-contamination of other colours into your white. Faces are often a focal point of any miniature, so we want to make sure that all of these intricate details are picked out. I like to use Kislev Flesh for this, as it's lighter than the Cadian Fleshtone that we used earlier for the glaze. Use this to pick out the most prominent facial features such as the forehead folds, brow, nose and cheekbones with a thin line of paint. Whilst we're working on the face, we might as well add a few extra small details. First, mix in some Mechanicus Standard Grey with some Lamium Medium and apply this over the cheeks, chin and upper lip to add some 5 o'clock shadow effect. The mixture you want to go for here is roughly 4 parts Lamium Medium to 1 part Mechanicus Standard Grey. And if you're feeling brave, you can also take this opportunity to apply a small line of white to the eyeball and teeth, followed by a small dot of Abaddon Black to the centre of the eye. The final step of painting the small purity seal on the belt is to pick out the raised parts of the wax using some pink horror. This will be done by applying a thin line of Dawn Yellow running vertically between the 2 rows of stripes. To pick out the carapace of the Tyranid head, apply some small lines of Xereus Purple along the edges. The final step before we move on to our metallics is to give the stone ruin an edge highlight of Dawnstone. You could instead perform a dry brush if you prefer, as this will help to create a dusty stone texture. The final edge highlight to apply is Stormhost Silver, and this will be applied to the remaining gold and silver parts of the miniature. The thin, bright silver line will give the effect of metal reflecting light off its most prominent parts. And here we have the completed Marneus Calgar. I finished things off by varnishing and assembling the components before creating a simple basing scheme using some texture paints and grass tufts. Whilst I've tackled Marneus Calgar in this video, you could easily apply the same steps to his Honor Guard or any other Ultramarine miniatures. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment I've used to create this video, such as my everlasting wet palette. If you enjoyed this video, do let me know in the comments below, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my Patreon page if you'd like to support me in making these videos. If you have any questions or would just like to chat with others who enjoy my channel, I've set up a Discord server which you can find a link to in the description below. So the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching and goodbye.